Fisayo, a vibrant young Yoruba man with a passion for music, and Chetam, a spirited Igbo woman with a love for art, met at a cultural festival in Lagos. It was an event filled with colorful displays of Nigeria's rich heritage, where traditions from various tribes mingled in harmony. As Fisayo strummed his guitar, his eyes met Chetam's across the crowd. She was admiring a painting, lost in its beauty, when she felt his gaze. When their eyes locked, it felt like an electric spark ignited between them. They spent the rest of the evening talking, laughing, and discovering a deep connection that neither had ever felt before. By the end of the night, they were inseparable, and within a week, they knew they had found something special. Despite the short time, Fisayo proposed to Chetam, who happily accepted. They decided to get married 3 months later, believing that they had found their soulmates. However, Fisayo's mother, Mrs. Adeola, was not pleased. She had always dreamed of her son marrying a Yoruba woman, someone who would uphold their traditions and values. To her, Chetam represented the unfamiliar, and the rushed decision made her even more uneasy. The wedding went ahead despite her objections, but her disapproval was palpable. 2 years into their marriage, Fisayo and Chetam were still childless. This only fueled Mrs. Adeola's bitterness. She would visit their home frequently, making sarcastic remarks and pressuring Chetam about when she would give her a grandchild. Mrs. Adeola's frustration reached a boiling point. Desperate for a grandchild and convinced that her son's marriage to Chetam was a mistake, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She made a plan with her best friend to bring Deborah, her friend's 18-year-old daughter, into Fisayo and Chetam's home under the guise of needing help with household chores. Deborah, a quiet and obedient girl, arrived at their home one afternoon. Mrs. Adeola introduced her as someone who would assist Chetam with the housework, claiming that she needed a place to stay temporarily. Although surprised, Chetam welcomed Deborah warmly, unaware of Mrs. Adeola's true intentions. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Adeola subtly encouraged Deborah to get close to Fisayo. She made sure Deborah was always around him, doing little things to catch his attention. Despite these efforts, Fisayo remained oblivious to his mother's scheme, as his love and loyalty to Chetam were unwavering. Chetam began to notice the increasing presence of Deborah around Fisayo. She felt uneasy, but chose to trust her husband. Mrs. Adeola, desperate to see her plan succeed, continued to encourage Deborah to seduce Fisayo. Deborah, feeling the pressure and wanting to please Mrs. Adeola, decided to take more drastic measures. She managed to obtain a drug that would sexually stimulate Fisayo and make him very sexually aroused. One evening, Deborah found an opportunity to slip the drug into Fisayo's drink. Unaware of what was happening, Fisayo began to feel its effects. Confused and overwhelmed by his sudden arousal, he struggled to maintain control. Deborah, noticing his vulnerability, seized the moment. She approached him, dressed provocatively, and made her move. Fisayo, in his drugged state, could not resist her advances. He fell for Deborah's seduction, and without realizing the full extent of his actions, slept with her without protection. The next morning, as the effects of the drug wore off, he felt a sense of dread and confusion, but couldn't fully recall the previous night's events. Months passed, and Deborah's belly began to grow. Fisayo and Chetam noticed the change, and while Fisayo felt a gnawing suspicion, he couldn't bring himself to believe that he might be the father. The truth finally started to unfold when Mrs. Adeola visited and began treating Deborah with unusual kindness and attention. "You're glowing, Deborah," Mrs. Adeola said, beaming with pride. "You've done such a good job." Fisayo and Chetam exchanged puzzled glances. Fisayo's heart sank as his mother continued, dropping hints that suggested the baby might be his. "This child is a blessing, Deborah. It's what we've all been waiting for." Chetam, putting the pieces together, confronted Mrs. Adeola. "What are you saying, Ma? Are you implying that this child is Fisayo's?" Mrs. Adeola, caught off guard, tried to backtrack. "Well, it's just..." You know how things happen. Sometimes the right person comes along at the right time. Fisayo, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal, denied the allegations vehemently. This isn't true. I would never betray you like this, Chetam. We'll get a DNA test when the baby is born. In a bid to contain the growing embarrassment and tension, Chetam reluctantly allowed Deborah to stay with them until the child was born. However, Deborah stopped working as a maid and took every opportunity to flaunt her pregnancy. She would often try to get Fisayo to cuddle her and rub her belly in front of Chetam, attempting to provoke jealousy and anger. Despite Deborah's manipulative behavior, Fisayo stood firmly by his wife's side. Each time Deborah tried to create a scene, Fisayo rebuked her sharply. "Deborah, stop this nonsense. My loyalty is to my wife. This behavior will not be tolerated." Months passed, and Deborah eventually gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The results of the DNA test confirmed Fisayo as the father of Deborah's child, and the revelation shattered Chetam's heart. Unable to bear the pain and betrayal, Chetam moved out of the house. Mrs. Adeola seized the opportunity to install Deborah as the new wife after she was discharged from the hospital, hoping to maintain her influence over the family. Fisayo, deeply hurt and longing for Chetam, allowed Deborah to stay only because of his responsibility toward his son. However, he never gave Deborah any attention, barely stayed at home, and never ate the food she prepared. He would come over on weekends, pick up his clothes, bring toys for his son, and leave the house alone for Deborah. As time passed, Deborah began to feel increasingly lonely and sad. She had naively believed that having a child for Fisayo would make him love her, but his coldness and absence made her realize the gravity of her mistake. One day, driven by desperation and curiosity, Deborah followed Fisayo after one of his weekend visits. She was stunned to discover that he was still together with Chetam. They had rented an apartment and were living together, trying to heal and rebuild their relationship away from the chaos at home. After discovering the truth about Fisayo and Chetam's continued relationship, Deborah was devastated and overwhelmed with guilt. She confronted Mrs. Adeola, blaming her for orchestrating the scheme that had sabotaged Fisayo's marriage and ruined her own life. Mrs. Adeola, confronted with the consequences of her actions, could only watch as Deborah's life fell apart. One day, Deborah left the baby with Mrs. Adeola under the guise of running an errand, but never returned. Fisayo, worried about her sudden disappearance, searched her room and found a letter she had left behind. In it, Deborah confessed everything: her plot with Mrs. Adeola, her manipulations, and her elopement to the United States with a new lover. Fisayo was furious and hurt beyond words. He confronted his mother, his voice trembling with anger and disappointment. "Mother, what have you done? You destroyed our family and manipulated Deborah into this mess." Mrs. Adeola, confronted with the truth, broke down in tears. "I'm so sorry, Fisayo. I thought I was helping, but I see now that I caused so much pain. Please forgive me." Fisayo took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Chetam and I were fine medically. I was scared of fatherhood, and I begged her to be patient with me until I was ready. This was something between us as husband and wife. You had no right to interfere." Chetam silently listened from outside because Fisayo's voice grew louder in anger. Realizing the gravity of her actions, Mrs. Adeola pleaded for forgiveness from Fisayo and Chetam. She promised to make amends and to support them in whatever way she could. Fisayo and Chetam, though hurt and betrayed, chose to forgive Mrs. Adeola. They decided to focus on moving forward and healing their family. They legally adopted Deborah's son and raised him as their own, providing him with all the love and care he deserved. 2 years later, Chetam gave birth to a beautiful baby girl of her own. The family rejoiced in her arrival, celebrating the joyous addition to their lives. They raised both children with love and dedication, creating a supportive and nurturing environment for them to thrive in. Both Fisayo and Chetam poured their hearts into raising their children with love, kindness, and unwavering support.